The 5 decades after the Civil War were a kinetic age, an age of energy, the energy of a vigorous people making a new America.
What we have in the late 1860s, early 1870s is a tremendous power, a tremendous energy being released throughout the country. New people arriving, people who have been here seeking new opportunities, new power, the right to vote. And it's a tremendous time, and it seems like there are tremendous opportunities.
The momentum of the whole society was propelled by powerful new forces.
The period between the Civil War and World War I is a time of 3 fundamental forces sweeping over the country. Urbanization, the growth of cities; industrialization, the shift in the economic base toward manufacturing, large scale; and the third, immigration. All 3 of these worked together to create major change in the American way of life.
These forces had already been at work in Boston for over 2 generations. The country's first aerial photograph over Boston just before the Civil War shows what the Industrial Revolution has in store for America's cities. The harbor that connected Boston to China now connects New England factories to the rest of the world.
Someone said that you can't look very far back into any prominent New England family's lineage without finding at least one China trader. Merchant families were engaged in this trade, a tremendous source of wealth, and they turn increasingly to investing in manufacturing. The first real manufacturing establishment is set up, and inside this one building you'll have all of the different processes involved in turning woolen fiber or cotton fiber into a piece of cloth.
Large commercial buildings surge like glaciers into the fine residential neighborhoods of Summer Street. They look like they are pushing the Fort Hill slums into the harbor. At the same time Boston is industrializing, waves of immigrants flood into the city.
The influx of the Irish grew gradually for a period of time, but of course the floodgates opened in 1846 and 47 and 48 when the Great Famine hit Ireland. So that by the Civil War, roughly, Irish Catholics in Boston constituted about 1/3 of the population already. And it continued to go up. One of the things we tend to forget is that so much emphasis is placed on Irish immigration before the Civil War that we forget about the fact that after the Civil War, that immigration continued.
After the Civil War, the number of people coming into the country exploded. During the 1870s, 5,000 immigrants flowed into Boston every month. Boston's response to the rapid population growth was to acquire more land for housing.
It's a period of expansion. It's a period of building. In the 1870s, Boston will annex Dorchester, for example. It will annex Roxbury. It will annex Charlestown. It will annex Brighton. These will all become part of the city of Boston, which means that Boston is no longer the little walking city.
But Boston is not satisfied with just buying land. It decides to build more.
The original Shawmut Peninsula was a very small peninsula. It was shaped as a 3-lobed leaf with deep indentations or coves between the different lobes of the leaf. The stem of the leaf was a very narrow neck that connected Boston to the mainland. Right about 1800, there was an explosion of land making, probably originally precipitated by the economic revival associated with Boston's China trade. And they began filling around the edges of the peninsula. The cove that is now the central waterfront area was filled in the 1830s and 1840s for railroads. The edges of Back Bay were filled actually between 1796 and the 1850s, but the big project began in 1855 and continued into the 1880s.
People marvel as they watch the first steam shovels load a train with 35 carloads of gravel in 10 minutes. At capacity, one of these trains arrives in the Back Bay every 45 minutes. And steam does more than power the machines making new land.
The steam engine makes it possible to have really large-scale manufacturing plants in a relatively small area. In South Boston, for example, we have a huge iron foundry. Steam engines power elevators, they power factories, they do all kinds of work. Steam power really helps newspapers become the dominant media in this period. The steam press allows a newspaper that ordinarily would have cost $1 or more and selling for a penny apiece.
But there is a downside to the hundreds of steam engines powering Boston's Industrial Revolution.
Safety is a concern. A lot of horrible railroad accidents in the early days. But you read accounts of boiler explosions in 19th century cities. A newspaper story the next day always says that bodies were blown 1/4 mile in the air. And it doesn't make any difference how big the boiler was, how close the people were, what the container mechanism was. It's a journalistic rule of thumb that you have to say bodies were blown 1/4 mile in the air.
Steam engines also revolutionized transportation.
Boston becomes known as the hub, mainly because of all of the railroad lines that intersected here. This really makes it the center of New England culture.
With railroads delivering more and more freight tonnage into the hub, the infrastructure to distribute those goods also had to grow rapidly.
There was a revolution in horse use in the middle 19th century that has gone largely unnoticed, and it was a byproduct of the railroad revolution. For every ton of freight that was moved by railroad had to be delivered locally, so that there was much greater demand for horses. In the 1870s alone, the number of horses more than doubled.